Caesar, as I have said, hurried to Brundisium about the time of the winter solstice, judging that surprise would best strike terror into his enemies. He found neither provisions nor equipment nor a complete army gathered in Brundisium. But nonetheless, he called an assembly of those who were present and said, "Men, my partners in this great enterprise, I shall not be prevented from starting out either by the winter season or by the slowness of other people, or by lack of the appropriate stores. In place of all these, I think swiftness of action will serve. I believe that we who are the first to gather here should first leave behind our slaves, our pack animals, our baggage, in fact everything necessary to ensure that the ships we have here will accommodate us. And we should then embark immediately on our own and make our crossing in order to catch the enemy off guard." So Caesar, as always, calculating that catching your enemy off guard is more important than almost anything else, more important than logistics and provisions, even, potentially anyway. "Against the winter weather, we can set our good fortune. Against our low numbers, our daring, and against our lack of supplies, our enemy's abundance of them, which it is quite possible for us to seize as soon as we land, if we realize that failure will mean we have none of our own. Let us attack their slaves and equipment and provisions while they are passing the winter under cover. Let us attack while Pompey imagines that I am spending the winter like him, or am occupied with consular pomp and sacrificial ritual. You understand war, and I put it to you that the mightiest weapon of war is surprise. It will also be the most signal honour for us to preempt the glory of the events that are about to unfold, and to make everything over on the other side secure before the arrival of the forces which will directly follow us. Speaking for myself, at this critical moment, I would rather be afloat than making a speech, so that Pompey, who imagines I am dealing with consular business in Rome, could set eyes on me. As for you, although I know you are not difficult to convince, I nonetheless await your answer." And that's the end of Caesar's little speech. Appian continues the narrative saying, "The whole army shouted enthusiastically for him to lead them on, and he took 5 legions of infantry and 600 picked cavalry straight from the speaker's platform down to the sea, where he had to ride at anchor because of rough weather. It was the winter solstice, and to his distress and frustration that the wind kept preventing him from sailing for so long that he was still in Brundisium on New Year's Day. Then 2 more legions arrived, and he embarked them too, and put to sea in stormy weather, on board merchantmen, because the few warships he had were protecting Sardinia and Sicily. The gale carried him off course to the Cerunian ranges, but he sent the ships back at once to fetch the rest of the army from Brundisium, and himself made his way by night along a rough, narrow path to the town of Oricum, with his force split into several parts because of the difficulty of the terrain, and forming an easy object of attack if they had been seen. At dawn, his troops were with some difficulty reunited, and the commander of the Oricum garrison, on being urged by those in the town not to resist the arrival of a Roman consul, handed over the keys to Caesar and stayed with him in a position of honour. On the far side of Oricum, Lucretius and Minucius, who had 18 warships guarding grain that was aboard transports, scuttled the transports to prevent Caesar capturing them and made off to Dyrrachium. From Oricum, Caesar pressed on to Apollonia, where the inhabitants welcomed him, and the garrison commander Straburius fled. Caesar assembled his army and reminded them that because of their speed of action, they had, with some luck, survived the storm, made themselves masters, without warships, of a certain amount of the sea, taken Oricum and Apollonia without a blow, and were in occupation of enemy territory, just as he had said, while Pompey was still unaware of the fact. "If we can go on," he said, "and take Dyrrachium, Pompey's arsenal, before he arrives, we shall be in possession of all that they laboured throughout the summer to collect." With these words, he led them immediately on a forced march to Dyrrachium, without resting either by day or night. Pompey, who had been alerted by this time, made a rival march from Macedonia, also with extreme haste, because he thought of it the utmost importance, as indeed it was, to protect his own supplies. He cut down the trees along the route to make the going difficult for Caesar, removed bridges over rivers, and burnt all the available food stocks. If either army saw flames or smoke, or a cloud of dust in the distance, they assumed their opponents were responsible, and were spurred to rivalry as though it were a race. They could find time for neither food nor sleep, and the eager, urgent shouts of the men who were leading them along with lights, caused much disturbance and nervousness, as they believed the enemy drew ever nearer. From sheer exhaustion, some threw away what they were carrying, or hid in ravines and were left behind, exchanging their terror of the enemy for instant rest. These hardships were suffered by both armies, but nonetheless Pompey reached Dyrrhachium first and camped by the town. He sent ships and recaptured Oricum, and blockaded the coast more intensively with his fleet. Caesar made camp with the river Alor lying between himself and Pompey. Cavalry detachments crossed the river and clashed with each other individually, but the full armies did not engage because Pompey was still training his recruits and Caesar was waiting for his troops from Brundisium. Again, only half had got across. Caesar judged that if they sailed across in merchant ships in the spring, they would not elude Pompey's triremes, which would put out to open sea in strength and maintain the blockade. But if they crossed in winter, when the enemy were lying in wait among the islands, they might perhaps evade them, or even force their way through, because of the size of their ships and the strength of the wind. He therefore summoned them to come urgently. When they did not put to sea, he decided to go secretly across in person to his army, because he thought he was the only man who could easily make them sail. He told no one of his plan, but sent 3 slaves down to the river 1.5 miles away to get a fast light boat ready with a first-rate skipper, pretending it was for a messenger of his. Telling his companions to go on with the meal, he left the mess tent on the pretext of being tired, put on ordinary clothes, and immediately mounted a carriage and drove to the boat in the guise of Caesar's messenger. He gave his subsequent commands through his slaves, remaining anonymous under his cloak in the darkness. Although there was a gale blowing, the slaves encouraged the skipper by saying that this very fact would give them the best chance of avoiding the nearby enemy. The skipper forced his way down the river under oars, but when he came to the mouth, the wind and the rough sea were beating the current back. Urged on by the slaves, he made violent efforts, but the ship failed to win any ground, and so he grew tired and gave up. Then Caesar revealed himself and shouted to him, "Be brave! Face the waves! Your cargo is Caesar and Caesar's luck." The skipper and the rowers were amazed. They were all stirred to make a great effort, and by brute force the ship began to leave the river. But the wind and the waves were always threatening to lift it and drive it onto the banks, until near dawn the crew became afraid that in daylight they would be visible to the enemy, and Caesar, angry with the malevolence of the divine power, permitted the ship to turn round, and she ran up river before the strong wind. Some of them were astonished at Caesar's daring, but others criticised him for an exploit that did credit to a soldier, but not to a general. Again, one of your jobs as a general, certainly as a commanding officer, is to not get killed. That is part of your job. You're not expendable, right? So when someone like Caesar or Wellington or Napoleon, whoever, puts himself needlessly in harm's way, quite often their men or their senior staff are annoyed with them for doing that. Appian goes on. Caesar realised that he could not go unobserved a second time, and ordered Postumius to make the crossing in his place and tell Gabinius to bring the army across the Adriatic without delay, and if Gabinius could not obey, to give the same message to Antony, and thirdly to Calenus. And if all 3 refused, there was another letter to the soldiers themselves, saying that all who wanted to should follow Postumius to the ships, put to the sea, and come into land wherever the wind took them, without worrying about the ships, because Caesar needed men, not ships. Thus Caesar abandoned calculation and put himself in the hands of chance. Pompey, who was eager to anticipate such developments, advanced ready for battle. 2 of his soldiers, who were in the middle of the river, trying to find out where it was easiest to cross, were killed by a single soldier of Caesar's, who ran to attack them. Pompey then broke camp because he thought this was a bad omen, and everyone blamed him for missing an excellent opportunity. When Postumius arrived in Brundisium after his crossing, Gabinius would not accept the orders and led volunteers by way of Illyria, walking round the long way, without stopping anywhere. They were almost all killed by the Illyrians, and Caesar was too busy to take revenge. Antony embarked the others in the ships and sailed past Apollonia under full canvas in a strong wind. About midday the wind dropped, and 20 of Pompey's ships, which had put out to search the open water, sighted the enemy and gave chase. Because it was calm, Antony's men were afraid that the warships would hole or sink them, with their rams. They made the appropriate preparations and were already putting slings and missiles to use when the wind suddenly burst on them more strongly than before. Their great sails unexpectedly filled with wind again, and they sailed safely away. The warships were left labouring in the breaking waves and the wind and the big swell, and made vain efforts to prevent themselves being tossed onto a rocky and harbourless coast. After capturing 2 of Caesar's ships, which had been driven onto a mudbank, Antony reached harbour with the others at a place called Nymphaeum. Caesar now had all his forces with him, as did Pompey. They were encamped opposite each other, with numerous detachments of troops in forts along a line of hilltops. So this is an image to try and conjure in your mind of Dyrrhachium, that both sides sort of dug in and built a battle line, like a trench line, but both sides doing quite extensive, remarkable battlefield building trenches and palisades and watchtowers. We know that the Romans are great at that sort of thing at this time in history. Caesar's men are particularly great at it, if you remember the siege of Alesia, but Pompey's men are no slouches. I mean, they're the same soldiers, basically. Caesar's men are more veteran, but they're still Roman legionaries. That's one of the things they do. Can build a camp overnight, can build large-scale fortifications on the battlefield very quickly. And so it becomes like a contest who can build the most battlefield fortifications before there is the full-blown engagement.